Well, hello again. We concluded our last lecture, really the first series of lectures on the Civil War and Reconstruction, with the destruction of the Reconstruction governments following a long period of terroristic activity in the southern states. Terroristic activity whose goal was to prevent black people from assuming the rights that were the rights of American citizens. Over the next 15 or 20 or 25 years, from the close of Reconstruction into the early 1900s, we see the rise of a new form of racial control that comes to be known as segregation, or Jim Crow segregation. And that's what we are going to focus on today, in this lecture today. Before I get into the heart of the lecture, I'm wondering if you just would take out a piece of paper right now and write down the words or terms that you see as being critical in the understanding of segregation. When you hear the word segregation, what are the words or terms that immediately come to mind? Oftentimes, you can keep on. I'm going to talk for a minute while you're writing this stuff down. You can just have me droning on in the background. But oftentimes, we have, when we learn history in high school, maybe there's a paragraph or two in the high school history textbook about segregation, what's termed segregation. I would like to suggest to you that segregation was the single most important social institution in the United States from the period of about 1890 right into the 1960s. And that we do not learn anything about segregation, that we don't understand segregation, that it's a couple of paragraphs and maybe an hour or two in a classroom setting where we discuss segregation. That's something whose, I think, goal is to minimize what segregation was, minimize the meaning of segregation, and thereby also, in a certain respect, disempower us or disarm us in terms of being able to deal with contemporary manifestations of racial hatred. All right, so you should have written down a few words on segregation in this last minute or so. So I guess the word that most frequently students write down in terms of segregation, the response word that they come up with in terms of segregation is separation. And what I want to tell you, separate water fountains, separate waiting rooms, separate schools, separate library hours, separate museum hours, separate swimming pools. So all forms of separation usually are what students will refer to when they hear the term segregation. What I want to suggest to you, argue with you, insist upon with you is this, that segregation is not about separation. Segregation is not about separation. Segregation is about domination. And the complement of dominate, if you are going to dominate a people, you must humiliate that people. So separation, no. Domination, humiliation, that's the meaning of the term segregation. I'm going to prove that to you right now. I'm going to prove what I'm saying is true. And in order to do that, what I want to do is I want to divide the Southern economy following the close of Reconstruction into two distinct areas of economy. The first being the widely known cotton economy, and I will spend some time talking about the cotton economy in a few minutes. But the element of the economy, the side of the economy that I want to talk about right now, in order to emphasize what I've said about segregation, what I want to talk about right now is what I call the domestic economy, the economy of raising families, of making new members of a society, training new members of a society. And when we look at the Southern domestic economy, one of the things that is quite striking, one of the things that we see immediately is a stereotypical figure called the black mammy. In large parts of the South following the close of Reconstruction, white children were raised by black women. This was true not only for the upper classes of Southerners, but for the middling levels of white Southern society too. Perhaps you've heard the term wet nurse. If you haven't heard the term wet nurse, a wet nurse is a female who has recently given birth to a child and who therefore has milk in her breasts. And a wet nurse is a woman in that condition who nurses not only her own child with the breast milk that she produces, but also the child of another. That's a wet nurse, to nurse the child of another, to feed the child of another. And so the wet nurse, the black mammy, you can't really get much closer than that. This is not about separation. We also see it in the other elements of the domestic economy. A black female in the kitchen and cleaning the house was characteristic of large parts of the white South through from the 1890s into the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s. Here's a white woman talking about her need for domestic help. If I have white help in my kitchen, I feel as if I've got to work with them and be careful what I ask them to do. But I have no hesitation in ordering an N-word just as I please, and never think of needing to do anything myself. One of the things that we have to understand about this segregated society, and it was true of the antebellum, the pre-Civil War white Southern society as well, is that there is a fiction of white equality, white supremacy, the notion that white people are better than black people. White supremacy contains within itself this notion of white equality. All white people are better than all black people, and all white people are, at least politically, equal. And so if I have a white woman in my kitchen, I have a certain protocol. I have to have a certain protocol with that white woman. Nominally, she is my equal. I have to ask her nicely to do things. I can't just order her around. But with a black woman, there's no such constraint. A black woman must do what she is told to do, and I never have to worry about it at all. I just tell her what I want. Black women understood their position. They need us all the time. This is a black domestic worker. They need us all the time. They don't want no food unless an N-word cooks it. They want N-words to do all their washing and ironing. They want N-words to do their sweeping and cleaning and everything around their houses. The N-words handle everything they wears and hands them everything they eat and drink. Ain't nobody can get closer to a white person than a colored person. If we wanted to kill them, they'd all done been dead. Nobody can get closer to a white person than a colored person. Segregation is not about separation. It is about domination. The same was true of the cotton economy. In the cotton economy that followed the close of Civil War and Reconstruction, more and more white people moved into positions of working in cotton fields as, and we'll talk about the meaning of these terms in a moment, sharecroppers and tenants and small farmers, small landowners themselves. But as in the domestic situation, the landlords of the South far preferred, the landowners of the South, far preferred black sharecroppers to white sharecroppers. For the same reason that white women preferred black women in the kitchen over white women in the kitchen. The black worker can be told to do anything. The white worker, again, there has to be some protocol of pretense of equality. One turn of the century, a southern white landlord said this: if today they were all to take a ship for Africa, who would chop the wood tomorrow morning? Who would make the fire? Who cooked the breakfast? Who served it? Who would dress the baby? Who would hitch up the horse, ply the hoe, and guide the plow? It's not about separating black and white. It's about dominating black by white people. I mentioned that the principal forms of working the land took the form of sharecropping, tenancy, and small holdings, and then, of course, large holdings. And in the South, following the Civil War, large holdings were significant, and the way a large landholder would work his land was through the mechanisms of sharecropping or tenancy. Tenancy is more or less obvious. I have a certain amount of money, I have no land, I pay the landowner to work the land, and what I do on that land is my choice. It's my choice because I've paid the landowner cash money to rent the land. I'm basically renting the land from the landowner. When I rent the land, it's like renting a house. I put up the pictures I want to put up in my house if I'm renting the house. As a tenant farmer, I grow the crops that I want to grow, the way that I want to grow them, on the schedule that I want them grown on. A sharecropper is in a position worse than the tenant. The sharecropper has no land. What the sharecropper offers, and he has no money, what the sharecropper offers to the landowner in return for working the landowner's land, what the sharecropper offers is a portion of the crop, a third of the crop, a half of the crop. Whatever's grown, the landowner will get a third of the crop. But because the sharecropper is poor, and because there is a significant lag between beginning to farm, sending a crop out, and harvesting that crop, because there's a significant lag, there's a long period of time in which the sharecropper does not have money to pay for food or for clothing or for anything that his family may need in terms of these kind of things. And so in the interim, between the period of time when the sharecropper plants the crop and the sharecropper harvests and sells the crop, the sharecropper is dependent on the landlord or a local merchant for even things like seed to plant the crops with, and then still the food and the clothing that he's going to use for himself and his family while he's working. And the upshot of this is that the merchant or the landlord who fronts the goods to the sharecropper charges high interest rates for these goods. And the result again and again for sharecroppers is that at the end of the season, after the crops are harvested, and he's paid the landowner for the crops that have grown on the landowner's land, paid half of what he's produced to the landowner, that oftentimes the sharecropper finds that he owes for the seed and for the food and for the clothing and for the shelter that the landlord has provided him. He owes more than he has produced in the course of that year. And the same thing follows in the next year and the following year and the year after that. So that there is a steady increase in the amount that the sharecropper owes to the landowner and the merchant. Booker T. Washington, who of course you all have heard of and which we will, about whom we will talk some more in our next lecture. Booker T. Washington, writing in 1889, says this of the sharecroppers. 5/6 of the colored farmers mortgage their crops every year. Not only their crops before, in many cases, they are actually planted, but in most every case, mules, cows, wagons, plows, and often all household furniture is covered by the lien. After a merchant has run a farmer for 5 or 6 years and does not pay out or decides to try mortgaging with another merchant, the first merchant in such cases usually cleans up the farmer. That is, takes everything, mules, cows, plows, chicken fodder, everything except wife and children. The system of sharecropping was a system of servitude that in some respects was as difficult as was the system of slavery. The system of slavery, the slave owner had an investment in each of his slaves, and so therefore worked to keep those slaves alive. In some cases, minimally so, for sure. But the sharecropper, the landowner who fronts goods to the sharecropper, has no necessary interest in maintaining the life of that sharecropper. And in robbing that sharecropper year after year after year makes manifest that he has no interest in maintaining the life of that sharecropper. Sharecropping is a form of servitude in which each and every year the sharecropper becomes more in debt and therefore more dependent upon the landowner. And the landowner, unlike with the tenant farmer, the landowner orders, I only want cotton on this land. You can't grow food and vegetables, fruit and vegetables on this land because that's not going to pay me at the end of the harvest. What's going to pay me at the end of the harvest is if you grow cotton and cotton alone. Not only does the planter command the sharecropper to plant what to plant, but also in many cases the landowner demanded that the sharecropper conduct his farm just as the landowner orders him to do. It is not all that significantly different than is slavery. All right, I want to turn to another element of the southern scene, an important element, and that is the relation between black farmers and white farmers in this early period following the close of Reconstruction. The period following the close of Reconstruction, as I think implied certainly in the lecture I gave about Reconstruction, is the period of the ascendance of great industry and capital in the United States. The railroads, for example, expand exponentially during this period of time. If you are a farmer, you are dependent upon the railroads to get whatever it is that you're producing to the marketplace. And you're dependent ultimately on bankers, financiers for lending money that in some ways, in some fashion, reaches down and reaches you. In a situation wherein the railroads and the banks and industry in general are growing at exponential rates, the power of these railroad owners and merchants and bankers also grows exponentially. And so the period following the close of Reconstruction, the early 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, is a period of extreme difficulty for the American farmer. And it's true in the South as it is in the Midwest. In this period of extreme crisis facing American farmers, a movement developed called the populist movement. The populists began as farmers who got together attempting to collectively deal with the problems of banks and the problems of railroads that were charging half or more of the worth of a crop that these farmers were trying to sell. In the South, the populist movement was very large and very powerful. And because of the desperation of the white farmers, the populist movement in some places, in Georgia, for example, involved a reaching out on the part of white farmers to black farmers. A reaching out, an olive branch, an attempt to unite the strength of poor white people with the strength of poor black people so that together they might take on the larger forces in their lives. The principal leader of the populist movement in the state of Georgia was a man named Tom Watson. And Tom Watson ran for Congress in the year 1892, was elected for Congress in the year 1892. Here's a portion of one of the speeches he gives to mixed-race crowds in Georgia in the year 1892. You are kept apart that you may be separately fleeced of your earnings. You are made to hate each other because upon that hatred is rested the keystone of the arch of financial despotism which enslaves you both. I hope you're understanding what Watson is saying here. He's saying both. When he says enslaves you both, he's talking to both the white farmer and the black farmer. He says you whites and blacks are made to hate each other because when you hate each other, you can do nothing as far as the real forces that dominate your life. You can't change, you can't challenge the financial rulers who dominate your life so long as you hate each other. You are deceived and blinded that you may not see how this race antagonism perpetuates a monetary system which beggars both. Gratitude may fail, so may sympathy and friendship and generosity and patriotism. But in the long run, self-interest always controls. Let it once appear plainly that it is to the interests of a colored man to vote with the white man, and he'll do it. Let it plainly appear that it is to the interest of the white man that the vote of the Negro should supplement his own, and the question of having the ballot freely cast and fairly counted becomes vital to the white man. Tom Watson, on this platform, was elected to Congress in the year 1892, uniting black and white. Black people still had, in Georgia, in the year 1892, the right to vote. At one point in the election campaign of 1892, a black preacher who was advocating for Tom Watson, the election of Tom Watson, was threatened by Klansmen, and he fled to Tom Watson's farm, and Tom Watson made a call for a posse of men to defend this black preacher, and 2,000 white farmers showed up to defend a black man threatened with being lynched in the year 1892 in Georgia. Watson would use his campaign rallies as means for pledging the white farmers to support for the rights of the black farmers. Here's from a biography of Tom Watson, a passage describing this. The Negroes responded to Watson's message with great enthusiasm. They thronged to his rallies by the thousands and stood side by side with white farmers, listening to him speak from the same platform with speakers of their own race. A favorite device of Watson was to pledge the white listeners to defend the Negroes' constitutional rights, making them hold up their hands to promise. So Watson would stop the campaign rally and ask all the white farmers to raise their hands and pledge their support for the maintenance of the rights of the black farmers. What we're seeing with the case of Tom Watson, what we're seeing is a situation in which white farmers are so far oppressed that for the first time, large numbers of those white farmers begin to question the validity of the doctrine of white supremacy. For the first time, they begin to see that the doctrine of white supremacy is a mechanism for keeping not only black down, but also these poor whites. That if the poor whites are more concerned about the color of their skin than about the fact that they are poor, they will never get anywhere. This is what the farm crisis, the agricultural crisis of the 80s and the 1890s does. It creates a situation in which these poor whites can begin to question hundreds of years of training in the doctrine of white supremacy. Unfortunately, white supremacy still had a large grip on these white farmers. In other parts of the South, the populist movement was divided by race. White farmers setting up populist organizations for black farmers putting white leaders on top of the black farmer associations. But even in Georgia, even with the case of Tom Watson, white supremacy was still very strong. Watson was elected to Congress in 1892, again in 1894, but in 1896, the landowners were able to scare the white farmers back into line. What they did was they accused Watson of fostering, quote-unquote, Negro domination in Georgia. And by loudly proclaiming this again and again, they scared the white farmers into voting not for Tom Watson, but for his segregationist white Democratic Party opponent. I want to pause here just to try to explain this. Again, prior to the Civil War, the poor whites of the South, as I've said, were in extremely desperate circumstances. They led, by and large, very poor, impoverished, miserable lives. And the only thing prior to the Civil War that they had going for themselves was, they said, well, at least I'm not a slave. At least I'm white. And so after the Civil War, when the white landowners in Georgia began to claim that Watson was fostering Negro domination, they called on that long training that the white farmers had in seeking refuge in the color of their skin as the salvation to their problems, their psychic problems in any case. And so Watson was defeated in 1896. He ran again for Congress, I think, in 1904 and in 1906. And he was elected in 1906. But when he returned to politics, he returned a very different man than the man who'd run for Congress back in 1892. He had been defeated by landowners who railed against Negro domination. And so when Tom Watson returned to politics, he returned to politics committed to dispelling any possibility that he, Tom Watson, could be accused of fostering Negro domination. He returned to politics intent on disenfranchising, taking away the vote of black people. No longer uniting black people with white people, but pushing black people out of the political arena entirely. Here in 1906, the white people dare not revolt so long as they can be intimidated by the fear of the Negro vote. Once the bugaboo of Negro domination is removed, every white man would act according to his own conscience and judgment in deciding how he should vote. So in 1906, he calls for disfranchisement of black voters, taking away their right to vote. 1908, he says this: the hour has struck for the South to say that the 15th Amendment is not law and will no longer be respected. 15th Amendment, the right to vote can't be taken away on the basis of the color of a person's skin. And yet, Watson is saying we've got to negate the 15th Amendment in the southern states. This is a white man civilization, and the white man must maintain it. This is the man who used to pledge white farmers, poor white farmers, to support black rights. And then finally in 1913, lynch law is a good thing. It shows that a sense of justice yet lives among the people. The man who defended a black preacher from a lynch mob in 1892, in 1913, 21 years later, defends the lynching of black people in the South. What's important here is that what I've tried to describe is the trajectory of this populist movement, this movement of poor whites, at least in the state of Georgia, a trajectory that begins with an attempt to unite with black workers, black farmers, and ends with those same white farmers demanding that black people be pushed out of the political arena entirely. All right, I'm just going to do one more thing before closing this section. I want to talk about how you disfranchise a black population. The 15th Amendment says if you're a citizen of the United States, you've got a right to the vote, and that right can't be taken away on the basis of skin color. So it's a very powerful amendment, and any attempt to take away the right of black people in the South to vote has got to work around that 15th Amendment. How do you do that? Well, you do that in part by looking at the actual condition of black people, and then passing laws which address the condition of those people. So, the mechanisms that were used to disfranchise black voters included what was called a poll tax. Poll tax is, I think it was $1 or something like that. If you want to vote in this election, you've got to pay a tax, $1. Well, what that does is it takes advantage of the fact that black people in the South in this period of time are extremely poor. I told you that the sharecropper is constantly falling into deeper and deeper debt. If you're falling into deeper and deeper debt, you have to think twice about paying even a small poll tax before you vote. And the thing about the poll tax is if you decide, well, I really don't think it's important I vote this year because whoever's running for whatever offices, the offices aren't that important. The candidates are nobody I'm really attracted to. I won't vote this year. If I want to vote next year, in the next election, I have to pay the poll tax for the next election, but also the election that I skipped. So once I skip the first election, it becomes more and more difficult for me to ante up the poll tax for subsequent elections. Literacy requirements. What we're talking about here is we're talking about a population that is 70% illiterate. The black population, following the close of Reconstruction, 70% of that population illiterate, can't read, can't write. And so I don't have to pass a law saying black people can't vote in the state of Georgia. All I have to do is I have to say, well, you have to be able to read and interpret a section of the state constitution. You can't do that, you can't vote. And by doing that, you eliminate 70% of the black population. Even if you're a black person in this period of time and you can read and you can write and you can interpret the Constitution, the literacy requirements were tested by white registrar of voters in the local counties. There's one famous story, or infamous, notorious story, of a black college professor who went to register to vote. Of course he knew how to read and write. He was a college professor. But when he went to the registrar of voters for his literacy test, he was given a copy of the state constitution in German and was asked to read and interpret a section of that constitution. And his response was that what he thought that the section of the Constitution he was given to read and interpret, what he thought that that section meant was that he wasn't going to vote. There was a difficulty with the literacy requirements in that, again, the system of white supremacy not only posits white people as better than black people, but also sets a certain plane that all white people are part of the same equality. So there are a lot of white people who don't make the literacy requirement. What are you going to do about that? You're going to tell those white people that they're the same as black people? That they can't vote? No. And so the South, in order to assure the right of poor whites to vote, poor illiterate whites to vote, passes a grandfather clause. And grandfather clause says this: if your father or grandfather voted in an election prior to 1865, you don't need to pass the literacy test. Now, no black people had fathers or grandfathers voting in elections prior to 1865, but white people did. And so, despite the fact that the white population of the South was largely illiterate, the grandfather clause assured all white people of their right to vote. Property and residency, having a certain amount of property, that eliminates propertyless people from registering to vote. The white primary, this is the last one. It's the hardest one to understand how it works. I think if you'll just bear with me for a minute, I will explain it, and hopefully you will be able to understand what it is that we're talking about when we say white primary. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution says the government can't prevent a person from voting on the account of the color of his skin. The 15th Amendment does not say anything about the Democratic Party. It doesn't say anything about the membership of the Democratic Party. And following the close of the Civil War, the Republicans were the party of the victorious North, and the Democrats were part of the party of the defeated South. And it's the Democrats who are most adamant about putting black people back in their old, accustomed place. And so, following the close of Reconstruction, in state after state, the Democratic Party was made a white people's party only. Black people couldn't participate in the Democratic Party. Now here's what that means. What it means is this, is that in a part of the country where the Republican Party does not exist, where the only political party of consequence is the Democratic Party, the next mayor or governor or congressman is going to be determined not in the general election. It's a foregone conclusion. Whoever is the Democratic Party candidate is going to be elected to governor or mayor or Congress. The only election of consequence is the primary election. A primary election is an election if you've got 2, 3, 4, 5 Democrats, each of them wanting to be the Democratic candidate for governor. How do you decide which of those is going to be the Democratic candidate? You hold an election, a primary election, and in the primary election, everybody who's a Democrat will vote for one of these 3 or 4 or 5 candidates, and the one who gets the most votes is the Democratic candidate. And again, as I said, if you're the Democratic candidate, you are the governor. You're the one who's elected to the position that you're vying for. So the only consequential election is the primary election. Black people are not allowed to vote in the primary, in the Democratic Party primary election. And so you may vote in the general election. There may be black people who vote in the general election, but who wins that general election has already been determined. It's been determined by the primary, and you didn't have any say in that. So these are the various mechanisms that the South used to disfranchise black people. Ladies and gentlemen, I will get back to you in my next lecture. We'll continue this discussion, talk about how the various Civil War amendments and legislation were overturned by the Supreme Court and how the legal basis for segregation was created in the United States. Thank you.